Hello, I'm here with David DeSchryver, Whiteboard SVP and Head of Research, and Marguerite Roza, who is a Whiteboard Senior Advisor and the Director of the Edunomics Lab at Georgetown University. We are here to talk today about what we know about the K-12 school funding environment, a situation that is rapidly changing. We started talking about this panel a couple of days ago under one set of assumptions, and 48, 72 hours later, we're already talking about a different set of assumptions. So I think we are going to endeavor today to talk about what we know, what historically has happened, and what we are grounded on from a legal perspective, and then some of the changes that the administration is working on and our interpretation of those, again, given the information we know today, which is subject to change. So with that as our sort of level set, I'd like to start, and it'd be fun to hear you both go back and forth on this, just as a baseline of how does K-12 funding work in the U.S.? I know there's a couple of different levels to it. It'd be really helpful to talk through specifically, what does a school in Nebraska, how does their funding come together? What is the constellation of inputs that go into creating a school budget? So Dave, if you want to start us off, and then Marguerite, you can kind of work in to make sure we get the full budget picture.
Well, I think two things. One is like, what's the structure of funding? And then we can talk about the process, the timeline of building the budget. Your hands went from top to bottom. So I think that's important because most of this is locally driven with state support. And then the federal sits on top of that as a supplemental source of funding, which these days is often forgotten, like 10 cents on the dollar. We recognize COVID was an exception, but generally 10 cents on the dollar. So primarily it's a local responsibility to fund schools, and the states by state helps out to help equalize that and provide some financial equity. And then the federal government jumps in and provides supplemental funds.
Yeah, I would say it's in perfect contrast to defense. Defense is all federally funded, and decisions about how we spend our defense budget, which turns out to be about the same size as all the money we spend in K-12 public education. They're about the same size, but the defense is all federal, right? It's run out of the federal government. It's all federal money. For K-12 schools, really most of that, 90% of that money is from state and local sources, a little bit sprinkled on top from the federal government. But all those decisions about the money, even how to what to do with your federal slice of it, are made very locally. In 13,000 districts across the country, leaders in each district are deciding how to spend their own share of all that money.
Can you just to dig into that a little bit more? So like, I'm a CFO or a district finance leader. What does my process look like? Like the school budget usually I think starts in like July or August. What does my process look like to getting a completed budget by the start of the school year? Hey, Marguerite, why don't you start?
Yeah, we call it the budget dance. It looks almost the same in every district, all 13,000 districts around the country. But usually in the winter, the finance team creates a budget that looks a lot like the previous, or, a draft that looks a lot like the previous year's budget. What are the forecasted salaries? In most of that budget is labor. So that's not hard to know, like, who did we have last year? What raises are they getting? We have the salaries and benefits bill that is 85 or more % of the budget, forecast and some other costs. And then we go back and forth with some board members, either the whole board or a subset. And that happens during the spring, and then the board votes on the final budget. So there's some trimming and maybe reinvesting, tweaking of the budget. And then usually in May or June, the board does a vote, and that becomes the official budget for the fall. This year, budgets are tight. And so some districts are doing things like reducing their staffing, doing layoffs and those kinds of things. That is all going to take place this spring. That's going to get hashed out. And some of these are going to be more contentious and newsworthy board meetings if they're going to involve layoffs and those kinds of things.
And I'll add that a lot of this, it's difficult work. It's a lot of guesswork. So if you're a chief financial officer, you don't know what state lawmakers are going to do. You got to guess on that. Hopefully they'll provide at least as much as last year. You're typically guessing what's going to happen in the federal government. In recent times, more so than usual. And so you have to, based on what you did last year, project on what you think you'll get. And that process evolves throughout the budget process. So it's always a challenge. I think the good news is that the Congress decided for FY25 about flat level funding. But even then, it fluctuates. So you may have a flat total level for Title I dollars, but how that plays out district to district because of the formula and because of changes in population and census and so forth, it may be dramatically different. It may be $1 million more or $1 million less. So there's a lot of educated guessing going
on.
Yeah.
One more thing I'll add is that a real concern this year, obviously people are really interested in what the play-by-play is at the federal level. A really big feature this year is, first of all, the ESSER is completely gone, the federal relief. And many districts use that to raise salaries or add more staff. And now, without this big federal funding source that was scheduled to end last September, districts are really going to have to budget without it. And that has created some holes in their budget. The other really big feature this year is enrollment declines. And that is because birth rates are falling and the federal relief funds kind of masked that, covered it up for a few years. So districts didn't have to wrestle with the fact that they had fewer students than the previous year. And since almost all of those formulas, federal, state, and local, are tied to enrollment, when a district has enrollment declines, they have a shrinking budget. And so that is putting a lot of pressure. And that's another, as David said, there's a lot of guesswork, forecasting, trying to figure this out. One of the things we're really trying to figure out, how many students will we have? And we know some districts had their enrollments propped up with some immigrant families. Immigration has come to a screeching halt, as we've seen in the last, actually since last summer. And so now they're going to be wrestling with just the birth rate declines and that have been plaguing their districts for a few years now. So there may be some shrinking going on this fall.
And Marguerite points out frequently, and what's growing? The number of FTEs, the number of staff. So you have your largest cost in the school district is usually labor personnel. For many, that's going up. And your largest source of revenue, the student enrollment, that in many cases is going down. With the expiration of the stimulus dollars in combination with whatever the state is doing, with rising costs of doing business, it's a difficult time to navigate this. So there are some challenges, and this will be, I think, for the next 2 to 3 years, a fairly turbulent budget process and a budget era for school districts.
So, I want our original intent with this was to talk about okay, what do we do when we're facing those sort of budget questions? Yeah. Again, we will spend a little bit of time on the federal level changes in a second, but to double click on to the, particularly the student declines against staffing increases, and the Egenomics Lab chart will be in this week's edition of Whiteboard Notes, which we're excited to highlight. Can we be pretty explicit about what gives, right? We see the trend. We know there's going to be a budget impact. I think we've heard rumors of maybe we can cut some ed tech. Maybe we can cut some, I'm not sure, where can schools actually cut? Or is it just staff? And when does that actually hit the fan? Timing wise, because I would imagine that affects, the next political cycle and all that. So when do we actually, does the rubber meet the road on remaking the budgets to today's assumptions rather than last year's assumptions?
Yeah, right now, this spring, these are decisions are being made. I think a lot of districts, so they hired new staff when they had all these federal relief funds. And so they grew their staff roles. A lot of them brought in more specialist positions, more reading coaches, kind of this sometimes non-teaching, but specialty roles, counselors, psychologists, social workers, all of those sort of deans positions in their school districts. And now they're saying, shoot, I don't have enough money to maintain these positions, and may have gone out and hired new teachers to fill some of those spots because some of those were promotions for people. And now there are a lot of districts that are hoping to shrink their staff roles through attrition. So some are offering early retirements or canceling maybe contracts with brand new teachers, or just saying if we are on a hiring freeze. So whoever leaves, that's our new smaller staff. And there's normally somewhere in the neighborhood of 3 to 8% attrition in a given year. So that'll be some clunky staffing for school districts, but until they have some of those notices, like I've even seen districts say, you get a $500 bonus if you say you're not returning and you let us know by this certain date, so we can plan ahead. But in the meantime, districts really hate laying off staff. And so they're going to try to shrink their budget any other way they can. So they're looking at all of their vendors, whether they're nonprofits, after-school providers, security systems, purchasing, anything they can do to cut there so that they don't have to send out a pink slip. And still some are sending out pink slips. That makes it a very hard year to be selling to school districts.
And there's some good news here, Matt. Look, if you're selling to school districts and you're making the case for your program intervention, the language and what we've done in the past is still relevant, maybe more so today. The job is still to educate and engage students and family. And so the more evidence, the more demonstrated efficacy that you have, the better case you can make along those lines, the more compelling that's going to be. So decisions have to be made, and in the process of making financial decisions, that's a way to demonstrate the value of the school district, and the value of the school districts is related to benefiting students. So what do you have to be able to make that claim? And this is not something that's new. We've been doing this for a long time. We've spoken about evidence and efficacy and high quality and teacher and student engagement and all these things. But now it's for real. We have to make some real decisions.
Something that comes to mind, and maybe this is business guy making too sweeping of a generalization, of understanding whether the budget that you're drawing from is like a discrete line item that is resilient year to year. Curriculum's one, security, you mentioned Marguerite, I think is another interesting one that I think is a little bit more new, but has its own budget line, and understanding what is the stack of discrete line items versus are you playing in a different pool? One thing I want to click on real quick, Marguerite, because I think I've heard you say it before, and I think it's really important, of this concept of promotions and how it affects the whole teaching labor force, right? So, I'll leave it at that. I think you know what I'm talking about, but I think it's really, really important for understanding the constitution of today's teaching labor force as a whole.
Right. So everybody's heard that the last few years was a teacher shortage, and that was likely triggered by the federal relief funds, which spurred a lot of hiring. And then, so when everybody was hiring, districts were hiring teachers and so on away from each other. But what they mostly did was they wanted more specialists, a reading coach, a math interventionist, whatever it was. And they hired that person, pulling oftentimes their best teacher out of the classroom, and they became kind of a more senior level, non-teaching specialist. Then they went out to the labor market to hire a new teacher to refill that opening. And many of the people they brought in were deeper and deeper into an already thinning labor pool. And so are some, not necessarily as strong or as proficient of teachers that are, those new ones that just recently hired. But the worry we have for many school districts is they now have this stack of non-teaching specialists that pulled their best teachers out of the classroom. They have brand new teachers in the classroom, some of them that maybe are not as strong a fit for education. And then the money stopped. And so now the shortage is over. Nobody's hiring. It's a hard time to find a job if you're a brand new teacher coming out of, a certificate program, because nobody seems to be hiring. But we've changed the dynamics of our workforce. We have a lot of this intermediate level positions that are newly promoted and a whole brand new, fresh teacher workforce. So it's changed. It's a different world than we were 4 or 5 years ago.
Well, and there's sort of a cruel irony in that, like, almost by promoting them now, the place that a lot of, observers who are not super steeped in the ecosystem are saying, like, who are all these non-teaching staff, right? And it's like, actually, those are some of the best teachers out there. And, you've given them presumably a raise and you've elevated their position. And so, like, sure, you could fire that layer of people, but that's the best part of your workforce. But it's also complex. Yeah.
Well, and some are offering them early retirements, and we say, stop.
But it's like, no, we want them back.
Yes. For many students, their school may have more specialists, but they might have, a teacher that's not as successful as the one that got promoted out of teaching. So we don't want to see that group go, for sure. We want to keep them in, but this is a shuffle that our system hasn't had to deal with before.
Yeah. So the point is, it's complex, and, like, be careful what you wish for in terms of how you reshuffle the labor force. Okay.
And can I add, it's not the one thing, and this is something David says constantly. You really have to slice and dice the districts. We're giving a lot of average pictures here, but some states are much more healthier financially, either because the state has more resources, or they don't have enrollment declines, or their districts got less ESSER to begin with, so they're not having as much of a cliff. And you can look, at some of the charts that we have, but, the Los Angeles area is going to be tough, I think, for the next couple of years, but places like Idaho are still strong financially. Districts that are more, that had fewer low-income kids didn't have as much ESSER money. Their finances are a little more steady state. And so if you slice and parse then segment out the districts, it's not the case that it's all bad, continuing on as they were before, and some that are going to be more struggling.
That's helpful. I want to get to the quiz portion of our segment here. So Dave, you're on the hot seat. Can you tell us what the heck is going on at the federal level? You mentioned before that funding is actually relatively flat, at least as far as we know today, Friday, March 21st. So don't hold anything against us that happens after this date. But you mentioned funding is relatively flat, but, like, I can't go 2 hours without hearing about something that's happening on the federal level. What is happening? And second, why isn't that affecting the funding out?
Yeah. Again, we're going to bifurcate at least. Let's separate executive orders from appropriations. So executive orders, the administration is using these as an extension of campaign promises and declaring and clarifying what they're going to do, and based on what they have said they would do. If anyone is surprised that there's an executive order to begin to close the Department of Education, well, you really haven't been paying attention. Like, we knew this was coming. That's different than whether they can do that. That's different than what does that mean for the law, because these laws stand independent, were authorized separately, many pre-exist the agency. So they'll have to be carried out. Now, the funding for that, Congress recently passed a continuing resolution for fiscal year 25 that should have been done last year. These are the funds that go out for July and the next school year for schools. And what they did was they just kind of scratched out 25 and said it would just use 24, replace with 2024. And so for those large accounts, special education, Title I, it just carries over. So it's flat funding. Advocates will always say that's not enough, doesn't catch up with inflation. I get it, but it's flat funding. So legally, what has changed from December to now? Nothing. Financially, what has changed from December to now? The good and bad news is nothing. Now, are there certain grants? Are there certain programs that have been pulled back for review? And is that causing consternation? Is that falling into the courts? For sure. But the big program and the big funds, those local financial officers who are trying to guess, and what they were guessing was that's probably going to be about the same, we're right. And so that's the good news. What's going to happen next year? Anyone's guess. It changes week to week, day to day, as you know that, like minute to minute. But I think that's kind of the breakdown on the separation between what's happening with the executive orders, and separate that from legal requirements, and separate that from appropriations.
So I'll just add that, so Title I, IDEA, Perkins, these kind of programs pretty much still there. There's an ongoing question on whether or not Medicaid could get a haircut, and there are some districts that use some of that money. It's a smaller part of the budget, but something to keep an eye on. I will say that districts are increasingly, and depending on which one, still kind of skittish. Even though they've heard this news, they're like, oh, next month they might pull the rug out from underneath me. So one thing I would suggest, because you could say, no, you got the same amount of money. This line item is protected. Everything's fine. And they're like, oh, well, I don't know. I read on Twitter that it all could fall apart tomorrow. And that concern is out there, right? So one thing I've been recommending is that if you're selling to a district and they're tapping a funding line that they're nervous about, you can offer a clause that can void the contract or insure the contract if that money disappears or is substantially cut. And that might overcome the fears that anybody in a district has and allow them to continue to move forward. I think that Title I, IDEA, some of these bigger programs are pretty safe in the long run, even next year and the year after. But, my crystal ball is not perfect either. So I could understand if a district was nervous about that. Those programs are popular on both sides of the aisle in Congress. I think they're not likely to cut them in any sort of substantial way. But, a guarantee in there for a school district would probably go a long way in making them feel more comfortable about continuing a contract.
I really like that suggestion. I feel sort of obligated to say, like, they cut half the department staff. Like, what are there things, we count on, like, Congress to set law, the executive branch to enforce law, and the courts to adjudicate that. But, like, if you cut half the department, what are things that, like, if they just don't do some of the things they're supposed to do, like, what happens mechanically? Like, some of that stuff, I imagine, like, if it's dispersing money, that's a little bit easier to just say, like, yes, it will probably still happen. But, like IES, the data collection agency, if you only have like 3 or 4 people left in the whole department, what if they just, like, don't do things? I get that that's an open-ended question, and I think, like, it'd be interesting to hear your hypotheses. Again, understanding that it's really hard to predict.
Yeah, it's hard to predict, and we don't have a clear answer to that. Is this going to break down some of the processes and the work they do? Absolutely, of course, right? No question about that. Not a lot of it is higher education and grants and managing federal student aid, so it's a huge chunk of it. On the K12 side, yet to be determined. The impact, certainly going to impact Office of Civil Rights. That's not only taking a hit in terms of personnel, but kind of shifting its priority. And we're in a phase right now, still within the first 100 days, where we see a lot of breaking. So let's break it, and then whether it gets fixed or how it gets revised, TBD. But it is causing a lot of concern. You do see some breakdown in terms of the data collection that is being done, the way the processes work, because contractors are no longer there to do it. So what will come next? We don't yet know, in part because we're still in just the break and see what makes a lot of noise phase. So the opportunity here, and I tell this to public officials all the time, is if there's ever an invitation for state officials and local officials to step in and say, this is what we need, this is what we expect, and this is how things should operate. It is about state and local leadership, and we are leading, so let's get this done. That's an opportunity, and I think an invitation to have that conversation.
And I think one thing, people are worried that Department of Ed staff disappear, and so does all federal money. So those are two different things for the most part. And some of these federal programs predate the Department of Ed. Title I existed before there was a Department of Ed. IDEA existed before there was a Department of Ed. So as long as the money continues to flow, I don't think most districts are going to see a massive effect from, employees disappearing at the Department of Ed. Especially if you've not been a district that's been on the phone with the Department of Ed a lot in the last couple of years, and most of them have not. Many of these programs are more managed by their state education agency. So the state education agency manages Title I and all these kinds of things. And then auditors that are separate, will come in and say, oh, you spent the money right or wrong or whatever. So I don't anticipate a major effect overnight. I think it's certainly a lot to the financial stuff. I think what's going on with OCR is something to watch. OCR is going to potentially go after a handful of districts, and we know already universities, and say, hey, I'm going to freeze your funds until you comply with X, Y, or Z. OCR is the Office of Civil Rights, and so they're paying attention, to school districts around transgender kids in sports or anti-Semitism and those kinds of things. Then they will probably go into a handful of districts, freeze their funds, and make sure there's some compliance, and then unlock them. So that is definitely something to watch. I don't see it doing, broad swaths of districts, more individual districts to make a point. But again, no perfect crystal ball there on that one either.
Yeah, it's tricky. And I think that distinguishment between K12 and higher ed is also important. I talked to a friend yesterday who's a postdoc, and the research job that they were hoping to get postdoc is no longer on the table, because the university they work for is in a hiring freeze, and a lot of their funding is now at risk. So it's super complicated. I want to wrap up here. I'm really grateful for having both of you. I appreciate particularly the tactical suggestions of, if you're working with a district, try to think about the type of language that you could put in an agreement that says, like, we understand how complicated it is to be operating in today's environment, and like we as a company can accommodate that. Like, that's what a good partnership looks like. And Dave, to your point about like looking for some vision, that starts, as most education in the US does, starts at the super local level, but hopefully boils up to state and even federal level vision. I think, setting aside the magnitude of the changes, I think a lot of people would have been excited to say, yeah, like, let's try some new stuff, just maybe in a slightly less rocky way. So,
well, and there might be some other new stuff coming. I think there may be a federal tax credit scholarship for ESAs or vouchers, which would not compete with state money. That would potentially open up more funding for homeschoolers or private schools. If that's a market you're in, that could be changing pretty quickly. It's already, grown a lot in Arizona and Florida. So there could be a few other changes along the way, and change isn't, depending on what industry, change isn't always terrible, but it is something to navigate. So stay tuned.
Awesome. Thank you both.
All right. Thank you.
Sure.